Hello and welcome to this discussion titled Next Steps in Decolonization. Today we will be discussing what exactly the United Nations should be doing to help colonize and oppressed peoples around the world. The 51st session of the Human Rights Council last week convened a panel discussion on Resolution 48/7 regarding the negative legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. That, coupled with the General Assembly's 2020 declaration of the fourth decade for the eradication of colonialism, may present new hope that the UN intends to reactivate its decolonization process from its 38-year-long slumber. Is this the dawning of a new era, or is this just noble-sounding talk? Our first speaker today is H.E. Leon Kalahau-Siu, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Hawaiian Kingdom. Minister Siu is a prominent strategist, advocate, and spokesperson for Hawaii's independence. He is a familiar participant in Geneva at the Human Rights Council and is working to restore or develop new relations between the Hawaiian Kingdom and other states. He is the chair of the Decolonization Alliance based in New York City, a co-author of the book Modus Vivendi, Situation of West Papua, and was nominated for the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Minister Siu, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Mahalo. Thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very pleased to be able to participate in this webinar. And actually, I am in Geneva, having attended the Human Rights Council last week, and I'm about ready to head back home. However, this is a real great opportunity to reflect on what happened here in Geneva over the past week. But before we get into that, I'd like to give a little bit more background on the issue of decolonization and the mechanism for decolonization that was set up by the United Nations. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, it had two primary objectives. One, to settle international disputes by peaceful means. That was the first objective. And the second objective was to decolonize the world. The UN set out to achieve this by creating a list of colonies and territories to be decolonized. About 100 colonies and possessions were placed on the list of non-self-governing territories, and out of that 100, 80 of them eventually became independent states. The UN mechanism of the Decolonization Committee. And that lasted up until 1990, when decolonization abruptly stopped. There are 17 remaining on the list today, 16 since 1990, and one more, French Polynesia, added on May 17, 2013. So for some reason, decolonization appears to have stopped at the United Nations, or at least slowed down to such a crawl that there's been no real addition to the membership of the United Nations through the decolonization process. In 1946, there were 51 member states of the United Nations. Today, there are 193. That means 142 countries, roughly 70% of the UN members, became independent since 1946. At first, the decolonization process was rather disorganized. As a result, in 1959, Hawaii and Alaska were improperly removed from the list and designated as being integrated into the United States. And I'll come back to that topic later. But in 1960, the General Assembly assembled its landmark Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. The Declaration affirmed the right of all people to self-determination and proclaimed that colonialism should be brought to a speedy and unconditional end. This is 1960. 2 years later, a special committee on decolonization was established to monitor its implementation. That committee is commonly called the Committee of 24. Some countries that were not on the list became independent after fighting horrific wars of liberation. About 20 resulted from the breakup of the Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia. Besides the 17 remaining on the non-self-governing territories list, there are dozens more that are seeking independence but are being ignored by the United Nations. Today, the unfortunate message being sent by the UN is, for a country that is not on the UN's closed list of non-self-governing territories, the 17, the only effective way to gain independence is to go to war and sacrifice many thousands of lives. To create such carnage that the UN would have to intervene. That is what it took for the two most recent UN members, Timor-Leste and South Sudan. So this past week, the Human Rights Council, the 51st session of the Human Rights Council, convened a panel discussion on Resolution 48.7 on the negative legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. Coupled with the General Assembly's 2020 declaration of the fourth decade for the eradication of colonialism, this presented new hope that the UN maybe intends to jumpstart its decolonization process from its 30 or 37-year-long slumber. This is the dawning of a new, or is this the dawning of a new era? Or is this just noble sounding talk? The states, so there was a discussion that took place last week, Wednesday, on the 28th of September. And this was a special time set aside by the Human Rights Council to discuss Resolution 48.7, the negative legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. The states and others who spoke at the Human Rights Council all strongly and eloquently denounced colonialism and its continuing negative impact. But not one country or speaker offered a plan or a course of action or a single thing to mitigate or solve this problem. Instead, they pointed out what an enormous task it would be to eradicate colonialism. Like it does with so many other great issues of import, the UN body likes to make grandiose statements and describing the obvious evil, but offers no suggestions on what could be done except to talk more emphatically against the evil. The Decolonization Alliance, which was formed in 2014, conducted a series of decolonization dialogues in 2014-2015 in the margins of the UN General Assembly in New York. It was immediately acknowledged that although the geopolitical aspects of colonialism have been fairly well addressed, except for what I just talked about, roughly 100 new states were produced through the decolonization process. The real negative impact of colonialism are the systems, the practices, and colonial thinking that are embedded into the former colonies, thus perpetuating and perpetrating a colonial, not a post-colonial world. In other words, we still are in a colonial situation globally. And so this is what we find ourselves in, that even though most of the world appears to have been geopolitically decolonized, the thinking and the processes and the programs and the actual systems are still colonial systems. The great South African writer and activist Stephen Biko said, the most potent weapon of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. The true negative legacy of colonialism is a colonized mind. People whose countries are free, but whose minds and the society and the systems and institutions are still captive to the colonial culture are not free. One of the often repeated elements of the Human Rights Council discussion was how colonizing the existing systems and institutions would be enormously challenging, that it would be very complicated and require tremendous effort to unravel the negative legacies of colonialism. This, to me, is a lame excuse for doing nothing. It says, do not expect any substantive changes for some time because we have to figure out what to do. Hawaii rejects the notion that the solution is hard. The solution is not, the solution to a bad action is to stop doing the bad action. It's very simple, actually. After one of our decolonization dialogues in 2015, I was speaking to the ambassador from Palau. He was a pediatrician by training, but he was now the ambassador. And we had been discussing the acts of repentance. The Methodist Church had been a big sponsor of that particular decolonization dialogue. And so I asked him, specifically, what could the Methodist Church do to demonstrate its remorse or its repentance from its role in promoting colonialism all of those years? He surprised me. He said, breastfeeding. I said, breastfeeding? He said, yes, and here's why. He said, when under the colonial years, when the mothers in our community were told that breastfeeding was insufficient for the raising of children, that instead they should use these wonderful formulas that are being created by these corporations. And so they convinced the women that they were inadequate to support or to nurture their own children. And everybody switched over to formulas, which were, of course, imported by the colonial countries. And what he said was that this did tremendous damage to the health of not only of the babies who grew up later in later generations to be leaders in a community. He said that the problems, the health problems, and many of the leadership problems and also the cognitive problems that they're having in their society stem from the fact that their children were not raised on their mother's milk. So he said that one of the greatest damage that has been caused by colonialism was convincing the colonial people that their own processes, their own physical abilities were not adequate to live in a modern society. And so he said this attitude permeates the entire social structure as well as the political institutions, that everything that we do as Native peoples can't measure up to what the colonial peoples do. And therefore, we need to adopt colonial systems. And so he said that it would make a profound impact if the Methodist Church were to start up a program in each community to teach mothers that their milk is good for their children, and so are their foods, and so are the other methods and of their culture that was meant for the health and the welfare of their own community. So he said that would alter the thinking of indigenous peoples and of Native peoples and of minorities, that they actually do have the tools to be able to govern themselves, that self-determination is not based on somebody else's principles and somebody else's standards. And I thought about that, and I thought, this is profound. We're looking for all of these big these big answers and solutions to the problem of decolonization when it's right there in front of us. It's just that we have to stop acting in a colonial way, that needs to be dispensed with, and we need to encourage the people that their own systems, the abilities that God gave them, are actually really the most effective way for them to deal with their own lives. So I thought that this is that we need to start thinking in terms of that. We need to simplify and not confuse or complicate the actual solutions to the damage that have been created by colonialism. So I think I will stop there for now, because I can talk a little bit more later about what happened in Hawaii.
Okay, thank you, Minister Xiao. Now, I would like to give a brief presentation on the current situation in Luchu, also known as Okinawa. So, let me share my screen here. Can everyone see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, situation of the Luchu Islands, also known as Okinawa. Before I continue, I should say this presentation contains images of graphic violence and warfare. Viewer discretion is advised. I am Robert Kajiwara, native Luchuan, also known as Okinawan. I'm also a Hawaiian Kingdom national. I'm president of the Peace for Okinawa Coalition, headquartered in Okinawa City. Circulation 2.6 million, and endorsed by numerous other Native Okinawan organizations. We are dedicated to promoting Luchuan culture, history, languages, and rights. In 2018, I petitioned to stop the illegal construction of the US military base at Hinoko, Okinawa, receiving over 212,000 signatures. I have a PhD in history, ABD from Manchester Metropolitan University, Master of Asian International Affairs from University of Hawaii, and an MA in history from University of Nebraska. So Luchu, Luchu is the native pronunciation. In Chinese Mandarin, it's pronounced Lo Chou. And then you have a couple different spellings of Luchu. The historic American spelling, as well as the historic British spelling. Ryukyu is actually a Japanese term, although that is the more common term today. It's actually not even a native term. It is a foreign Japanese term that historically it would have been completely foreign and unfamiliar to native Luchuans. Today, there are around 1.4 million indigenous Luchuans living in the Luchu Islands. So since time immemorial, Luchu was an independent nation with our own unique history, culture, languages, values, and identity. We've developed these over the course of thousands and thousands of years, but today, due to US and Japanese imperialism and colonialism, all of the things we hold sacred are under threat. So as you can see from this map, Naha, which is the largest city in the Luchu Islands, is actually much closer to Manila, Pyongyang, Seoul, and many major Chinese cities than it is to Japan's capital of Tokyo. So Luchu's convenient location has always benefited the Luchuan people. this has gone on since ancient times. Lu Chu had peaceful, friendly, mutually beneficial relations with China, Korea, and Southeast Asia. Lu Chu's sovereignty was recognized and guaranteed by both the Ming and Qing dynasties. So this photo here, you can see this is one of the annual reenactments of the arrival of Chinese diplomats to Lu Chu. And this, well, before the pandemic and before 2019. In 2019, Lu Chu's historic Shuri Castle tragically burnt down in a fire. So, since 2019, the reenactments have not really been held, but before 2019, they were held every year. This was a huge event attended by thousands. It was a very popular event. So today, the United States and Japan, they love to say things like, "Oh, we have to place a lot of military bases in Lu Chu or in Okinawa because of the threat of China, the so-called threat of China." But as you can see here, Lu Chuans have always had very peaceful and friendly relations with China, going back to ancient times. So much so that even in the modern day, Lu Chuans still reenact this very special and sacred a bond of friendship between Lu Chu and China. It's still valued very much so, even to this day. So Chinese culture is still very prevalent in Lu Chuan culture and society, in spite of the ongoing US and Japanese oppression that has occurred in Lu Chu for over 100 years now. So it is important to point out that over the course of thousands of years, China has never once harmed Lu Chu in any way. China has never invaded Lu Chu. And in fact, China has actually helped Lu Chu in numerous ways. And so Lu Chuans to this day still remember all the positive things that China has done to help Lu Chu. Lu Chu was always recognized as a sovereign nation by other Asian nations. During the mid-19th century, Lu Chu was recognized by Western powers as a sovereign country via the signing of treaties with the United States, France, and the Netherlands. However, during the 1870s, Japan began the process of invading and illegally annexing Lu Chu against the will of native Lu Chuans. This photo here, taken around the year 1879, where Japanese soldiers had just invaded Lu Chu. And here they are standing in front of the gate to Shuri Castle. Shuri Castle was the home of the Lu Chuan monarchy, ruling royal family. And in this photo here, these are Lu Chuans living in China. They had fled to China in exile after Japan invaded. And so they continued to live in China, where they tried to ask the Chinese government to help restore Lu Chu's independence. Of course, China at the time, under the Qing dynasty was in decline. China was simply too weak to do anything to help Lu Chu. And then the photos on the right here, this is the historic Lu Chuan consulate in Fuzhou, China. It was used by Lu Chuans for over 500 years. And even to this day, China has still maintained these buildings because of the historic and cultural value, because of that link between China and Lu Chu. During World War II, Japan intentionally placed an inordinate amount of military forces into Luchu with the intent of sacrificing indigenous Luchuans in order to protect Japan. This resulted in the Battle of Okinawa in 1945, in which around 200,000, or 1/3 of the indigenous Okinawan population, was killed during a period of just around 3 months. Could you imagine 1/3 of any nation's people killed in just 3 months? That is an atrocious number. Could you imagine any other country, whatever country the viewers are living in, if you could imagine 1/3 of your population killed because two foreign powers decided to go to war in your country, a war that you and your people had nothing to do with in the first place. It's just incredible, incredible. Japanese soldiers deliberately targeted Luchuan independence leaders, those who had a pro-China view, which was a lot, and those who were caught speaking the native Luchuan languages. They deliberately murdered men, women, and children. After World War II, most of Japan's other colonies regained their independence, but not Luchu, because the United States decided to keep Luchu for itself to use for military bases. Facing widespread resistance from Luchuans, in 1972, the US gave Luchu to Japan. And since then, Luchu has been under joint occupation by both the US and Japan. Today, US and Japanese military bases take up around 15% of Okinawa's land and around 30% of the arable or best lands, but contributes only around 5% to Okinawa's economy, running at a huge deficit. This is a massive economic burden on the native Okinawan people. In addition to economic hardship, the US military also causes many other problems, such as crimes, which are well publicized. Between 1972 and 2016 alone, US soldiers committed almost 6,000 crimes, including 576 felonious crimes, such as murder or rape. Okay, if you could imagine a foreign military presence in your home, your hometown, your home nation, and not only are they unwanted, not only are they causing all sorts of economic hardship, but they're also committing crime against your own people, against especially targeting women and children. They're committing murder and rape against the native people. In addition, the U.S. military aircraft also are involved in numerous accidents. Between 1972 and 2016 alone, there were 709 accidents caused by U.S. military aircraft. These accidents often endanger the lives of the native people, sometimes injuring or killing people. The U.S. military also causes major health and environmental damage, including the poisoning of Okinawa's drinking water with cancer-causing chemicals. So this was just a very brief overview of a few of the problems that the US and Japan militaries cause in Luchu. And of course, the native Luchuan people are very strongly opposed to the US and Japanese military presence. Around 90% of Luchuans oppose the military bases. And there are daily ongoing protests that have occurred every day for decades, demanding the removal of the US and Japanese military bases. And so, although the US and Japan constantly insist that the bases are necessary in Okinawa in order to so-called protect Okinawa from China. But as I said before, Luchu and China historically have a very peaceful and friendly relationship. And so even the US government has privately admitted that Okinawans don't see China as a threat. And they say that Okinawans have a pro-China, anti-US bent. Okay, this was published in the Wall Street Journal. We only know about it because of WikiLeaks. So thank you to Julian Assange for that. But you see, even the US government has privately admitted that Okinawans don't see China as a threat. And so their whole thing about, well, the military bases in Okinawa are there to protect Okinawa from China, it doesn't make sense. If Okinawans don't see China as a threat, then then the military bases simply are not necessary. Okay, this is just a partial list of previous statements that the various United Nations organizations have said about their concerns for human rights violations against Ryukyuans. Okay, this is just a partial list. As you can see, CERD has made a few different statements, the Human Rights Committee. Okay, but the problem is every time someone at the United Nations criticizes Japan regarding human rights violations against indigenous Ryukyuans, every time this happens, Japan simply ignores it. They just ignore it. So you can see what the UN has said in the past. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. These human rights violations continue on a daily basis. And what I said in this very brief presentation is only a short introduction to the major human rights violations that occur against us on a daily basis. So what we're saying is the UN has to take further action. Japan is not listening. Japan hasn't done anything to protect the rights of indigenous Ryukyuans. So what we're saying is something more needs to be done. The UN has to intervene regarding the situation in the Luchu Islands. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Let's see. Okay, for more on the human rights violations in Luchu, we would now like to turn to Dr. Xiao Junyong, an independent scholar of international human rights law in Beijing. The title of his speech today is The Human Rights Situation in Okinawa, or Ryukyu, and Decolonization Coupling Drive, a Chinese scholar's understanding. Dr. Xiao, thank you so much for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Okay. Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Okay. The title of my speech is Human Rights Protection and Decolonization in Okinawa, Coupling Drive. Chinese scholars perception. I'm an independent scholar of international human rights law in Beijing. Good afternoon, dear Dr. Rob Kajiwara. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this important online conference. Okinawa was part of ancient Ryukyu Kingdom, which was forcibly annexed by Japan in 1879. Okinawa now covers about 0.6% of Japan's national territory. In March 1945, the United States Army landed in Okinawa and carried out a long-term military occupation, continuously establishing and expanding its military facilities. In May 1972, Okinawa's sovereignty was transferred to Japan. In recent decades, Japan and the United States have been expanding and strengthening cooperation in a wide range of areas, including ballistic missile defense, cyberspace, outer space, and maritime security. Under the 1960 United States and Japan Mutual Cooperation and Security Treaty and Status of Force Agreement, and the subsequent peace and security guidelines in 2010. The United States and Japan reorganized the United States Force in Japan, transferring the Marine Corps Air Station in Futenma, MCAS, and relocating about 9,000 United States Marines in Okinawa to Guam and elsewhere. There have been about 55,000 United States military personnel stationed in Japan, with thousands of civilians and family members in addition. According to the governor of Okinawa Prefecture, in 2015, the United States military facilities deployed in Okinawa account for about 73.8% of those in Japan. According to the special measures agreement reached between the United States and Japan in late 2021, the average annual sports, including labor costs, utility costs, training equipment, and materials procurement, training costs, and facility improvement programs to U.S. force by Japan will be about 211 billion Japanese yen. The first part, human rights issues in Okinawa. In recent years, the human rights issues of Okinawa have been continuously brought to international organizations for discussion. However, Okinawans are not active in exercising their rights to self-determination due to various internal reasons that cause resistance against exercising such a right. The United States occupied Okinawa after World War II, and Japan ruled Okinawa for almost 80 years. During this period, Japan became a form only of the United States, and the US military bases in Okinawa had a great impact on local economy, culture, and social life. These external power structures have greatly influenced 3 generations of local people, and thus weakened their national consciousness. In addition, some parts of international law remain ambiguous or lack binding force for resolving the Okinawa issues. It will take a long time to develop new evidence to influence Japanese policy and international opinion. There are 2 important issues regarding the Okinawa: territorial disputes and human rights protection. For the territorial disputes, some argue that Okinawa can be part of a Japanese territory with a higher degree of autonomy. Others argue that Okinawa can be separated from Japan as an independent state through exercising the right to self-determination. There are also 2 ways to understand the human rights issues. One way is to grant Okinawa people the legal status in indigenous people and provide them with special protection in various aspects. The other way is to see them as military groups and ensure them be exempted from various forms of discrimination, or they cannot be recognized as indigenous people in this way. First, continued attention from the United Nations. On December 18, 2008, the United Nations Human Rights Committee is concluding observations on the 5th periodic report submitted by the government of Japan, clearly stated that the state party should explicitly recognize the Anu and the Okinawa people as indigenous peoples in its domestic legislation and take special measures to protect, preserve, and promote their cultural heritage and the traditional way of life, and recognize their land rights. On August 20, 2014, and is concluding observations on the 6th periodic report submitted by the government of Japan. The UN Human Rights Committee made it clear that the committee reiterates that it is concerned about the lack of recognition of the Okinawa and the rights of those groups to their traditional lands and the resource, and the rights of their children to language education. The state party should take further measures to amend its laws and fully guarantee the rights of the Anu, Okinawa, and Okinawa communities to retain their traditional lands and natural resource. while ensuring respect for their free, informed participation in policies affecting them and facilitating, to the extent possible, the education of the children in their own languages. The third differs from NGO. The International Career Sport Association, ICSA, has continued to oppose the indigenous status of Okinawans. On August 27, 2015, the NGO submitted a written statement to the Human Rights Council, asserting that Okinawans are born to be Japanese and that it is culturally and linguistically very feasible that people of the Okinawa tribe are victims of war, but they are victims in and of Japan and have not suffered from discrimination. ICSA claims that people in Okinawa are discriminated against is the political propaganda of China. On June 13, 2015, ICSA submitted another written statement by Okinawan Buddhist living in California, in which he or she claims that Okinawans are not indigenous people and oppose special rights protection. He or she demands that the Japanese government should pass a resolution to clarify that Okinawans are not indigenous people. The reasons are the Okinawa community has never been formally examined or recognized as indigenous by the local government of Okinawa prefecture. Some groups claimed that indigenous rights directed to the UN without first going through the process with the local government or the central government of Japan. By contrast, some other NGOs have continued to speak in support of protecting indigenous rights in Okinawa. These NGOs include the Association of Indigenous People in Okinawa, the Okinawa International Human Rights Law Study Group, the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, and so on. In November 2017, the All Okinawa Council for Human Rights, ACHR, and the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism, IMADR, submitted the report, The Human Rights Situation in Japan, with special reference to the right to safe determination of indigenous people of the Okinawa, which outlined the current protection of indigenous people human rights in Okinawa. The report highlights a number of issues, including the right to an ancestral land, the right to self-determination, and the violation of the economic, social, cultural, and development rights of the local people. The second part, the last part, the improvement of human rights in Okinawa depends on its decolonization process. First, a forward-looking goal towards the independence. Historically, the Ryukyu kingdom maintained close ties with the Chinese Empire and Japan. However, the Ryukyu people is completely different from the Yamato people in Japan. China also did not effectively rule the Ryukyu kingdom. If the Ryukyu kingdom have been independent through its history, the Ryukyu kingdom has a more frequent exchange with China. The first step of decolonization is to exercise the right to internal self-determination and to enhance Okinawa's autonomy. The enhancement of Okinawa's autonomy depends on its rising consciousness of local people. It is important for the younger generation of Okinawan to have a correct understanding of their history with thorough considerations for human rights and capacity building. The long-term goal of decolonization is to exercise the right to external self-determination and to strive for independence of Okinawa. Although it is difficult to achieve independence under Japan's rule of Okinawa for nearly 80 years. Upholding the right to self-determination is meaningful for combating human rights violations and promoting anti-colonization. The second, strategies for reducing human rights struggle while facilitating the decolonization of Okinawa. The fourth, actively using the mechanisms set up by indigenous rights protection institutions, such as those within the UNESCO. The second, actively promoting the national identity of the native people in Okinawa with international human rights organizations. The third, prioritizing the historic and current discriminatory colonial policies of the southern states with reference to the judicial precedents of Aboriginal laws in Australia, the United States. Furthermore, could consider suing United States government and Japan government internationally by using the tool of ICJ to struggle for the rights of independence. The fourth, training people who actively criticizing the impacts of United States military bases in Okinawa, reducing support for United States base and promoting the outward relocation of United States force and their facilities to other parties of Japan. The fifth, adhering the zeitgeist of peaceful development, criticizing the expansion of the United States global military presence through war, opposing Japan's revision of the peace constitution, and resisting the process of Japan's militarizations in the context of the ongoing, the potentially long-term Russian and European conflict. The last, the sixth, adherence to peaceful development, criticizing the United States for global military expansion and opposing Japan's revision of a peace constitution and militarization. Thank you. I would like to send my report, this short report, by email to Dr. Robert. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Xiao. To round out our panel of speakers today, we have Professor Alfred Zayas of the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations. He is a leading expert in the field of human rights and international law and a high-ranking United Nations official. He was the original UN independent expert for a democratic and equitable international order. He is also a former senior lawyer with the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Secretary of the Human Rights Committee, and the Chief of Petitions. He has authored a number of books in several languages. His latest book is called Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press. Professor Zayas, thank you so much for joining us again. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. I feel honored to participate in the webinar, and I very much endorse both presentations and analysis by Foreign Minister Leon Xiao, your own excellent PowerPoint presentation, which I would like to make available to my successor, Livingston Sewanyana, as independent expert on international order, and also the statement by Dr. Chu Junyong, particularly interested in his concrete proposals at the end of his statement. And when I get it in writing, I also want to share that statement with Sewanyana and with my other colleagues, the rapporteur on the right to health, the rapporteur on the right to education, the rapporteur on the right to culture, et cetera, et cetera. Indeed, one of the major issues that we have here is the issue of information, the issue of education. Most people in the world are unaware of these issues. If you say Luchu or Ryukyu, maybe someone will have an idea what Okinawa means. They will think of the Second World War and the Battle of Okinawa, but they will not associate it with the massacre of the people of the Luchuans in Okinawa. They will not associate it with the necessity to make reparation for the damage done. No one associates it with the idea that the Ryukyu Islands and the Luchu people are a legitimate aspirant to self-determination, and that they should be added to the list of non-self-governing territories. Famous French Polynesia was relisted in 2013. This is something that has to be done, and I could see that a number of states would have sympathy with the situation of the Ryukyans, and I mean especially in Latin America and in Africa. I think there would be plenty of states that would have the courage to make the proposal at the General Assembly to list the Luchuan people among the 17 countries that are currently in the list of the Committee of 24. Now, since this is being recorded, you're going to, excuse me for a second, I'm going to, the sun is now coming in through the window, and whereas at the beginning this morning, it was not particularly bright, now it is actually too bright, and my face is too pale. So I think I'm going to just simply put down the okay.
Leon, how are you doing on time?
That should be somewhat better. See, it's less bright than it was before. Now, let me go to the two resolutions that were discussed last week at the 51st session of the Human Rights Council here in Geneva. The resolution of the Council back in 2021, October 2021, 48/7, negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. In the operative paragraphs, there are two things that have to be recalled. The Council is calling on member states, all member states, not only member states of the Council, calling on relevant United Nations bodies, including UNESCO, agencies and other relevant stakeholders to take concrete steps to address the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. What does that mean, address the negative impacts? Well, we have a continuation of colonialism, as Foreign Minister Xiao correctly said. I mean, we have colonized minds. We have, shall we say, an indoctrination and brainwashing that paralyzes people from actually achieving their human rights, because they have been, shall we say, indoctrinated into thinking in certain categories. Now, education is crucial. Information is crucial. We all know that there is an information war going on. We all know that the information war uses fake news, fake history, fake law. But it's not just fake or the phoniness of the information that is out there. A major problem is this suppression of information, things that people do not know. That has to be corrected. I mean, there must be a concerted effort at educating the world about these issues that have been all too long forgotten. And as far as other forms of addressing the legacies, you also have to consider that the indigenous, whether it be the indigenous of the Ryukyu Islands, the indigenous in the United States of America and Canada, the indigenous in Latin America, essentially, they have been looted. Their natural resources have been looted for centuries. The result is that they don't even have the means to hire a good lawyer to present their cases to the Human Rights Committee, to the Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, to the General Assembly. I mean, we must find a number of states willing to put this on the agenda of the General Assembly. We know 2 years ago, when in December 2020, the Assembly adopted Resolution 75/123 on the 4th International Decade for the Eradication of Colonialism. This document in the operative paragraph calls upon the administrative powers to cooperate fully with a special committee to develop a constructive program of work on a case-by-case basis for the non-self-governing territories to facilitate the implementation of the mandate of the Special Committee and the relevant resolutions of the United Nations on decolonization, including resolutions on specific territories. The problem with this resolution is that it's only referring to the 17 countries in that list. And that is woefully incomplete, because I can think of dozens of other indigenous peoples who are entitled to self-determination, who are entitled to protection from the international community, and they're not getting it. Obviously, we've talked about the Luchuan population, and I think you are numerous enough to make a credible case in the General Assembly. But of course, you have the West Papuans, you have the Moluccans, you have the Rapa Nuis, you have the nearly 1 million Mapuches in Chile, you have the indigenous in Argentina and in Peru and in Colombia and in Central America. The amazing thing is that people don't visualize it that way. Whereas there was decolonization in Africa, in Asia, the indigenous of the United States, the Sioux, the Crees, the Cherokees, the Tingleys, the Squamish, were never decolonized. The Europeans who came as migrants to North America, not only did they pass on their European diseases to the indigenous population and decimated them, they also massacred them directly. I mean, if you read Professor David Stannard's book on the American genocide, what the Americans did to the indigenous populations of North America, it used to be 10 million when the whites arrived in the Americas. And at the end of the 19th century, there were barely 200,000. Of course, they have recovered a bit, but this is pretty much of a genocide. And I recall the book by Martin Luther King Jr., Why We Can't Wait, where Martin Luther King writes on page 120, our nation was born in genocide, quote unquote. Now, this is a tough statement. And what Martin Luther King is saying is that long before the Africans were brought to America as slaves, that the American settlers had found a way to rid themselves of the native population. On the other hand, go through America and you will see that there are literally tens of thousands of names of villages and rivers and lakes that are all indigenous names. Now, I think it is necessary to bring this on the table to say that there has been a genocide of the American native population and that there are consequences. Now, there are legacies to the extent that the Sioux and the Crees and the Cherokees were all, of course, deprived of their natural resources and of their natural wealth, and that entails an obligation of reparation to them. But it's also the fact that they were deprived of the exercise of their culture and their identity, etc. That is actually one of the greatest crimes committed in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, that you don't find that in history books. Here is a role for the UNESCO to educate people, to ensure that these very important moments in the history of the world are not swept under the carpet and forgotten. And so let me get back to the resolution of the Human Rights Council 48/7, which I consider to be a watershed. I think that this is an incredibly important resolution, and I think that China's participation therein has to be saluted. It was actually, when it came through back in 2021, I was surprised at the innovativeness of this resolution, which also in the operative paragraph says, invites United Nations human rights mechanisms and procedures in fulfilling their mandates to continue to pay attention to the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism on the enjoyment of human rights. I think that the word continue is too optimistic because I think that United Nations procedures, the rapporteurs, the independent experts have systematically ignored these issues. So it's not just continue to pay attention, but just simply to pay enhanced attention to the negative impact of the legacies of colonialism and the enjoyment of human rights. So eradication of colonialism entails a solution for the peoples of Hawaii, for the peoples of Okinawa, Ryukyu Islands, for the peoples of Rapa Nui, and for the peoples of West Papua, and so on and so forth. In my report to the General Assembly in the year 2013, that is report A/68/284. I repeat, A/68/284. You can get it on the internet. I recommend in paragraph 69 little n that all of these nations, all of these peoples who have a legitimate aspiration of self-determination, that their cases be dealt with by the United Nations, and that means that they should be dealt by the Committee of 24. I also proposed that petitions from these peoples be dealt with by the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and that the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination further transmit these petitions to the Committee of 24 in New York. When I was rapporteur, I had the opportunity several times to go to the Committee of 24, and I actually brought physically to the president of the committee some petitions concerning Hawaii and concerning Alaska. Now, what he told me is if a state, like in the case of Vanuatu, back in 2013, endorsing the relisting of French Polynesia, when a state made a proposal in the General Assembly, and if the General Assembly decided to add all of these aspirants to the list of non-self-governing territories, that they, of course, would deal with it, but that the committee would not ad hoc pick up a case unless it had a mandate from the General Assembly. So one of the concrete things that have to be done is to give the Committee of 24 a mandate to deal with all of these issues. Now, as far as repairing the negative impact of the legacies, as I said, there's an enormous, shall we say, financial debt of the United States, of Canada, vis-a-vis all of these indigenous peoples. But the great obstacle is here. The great obstacle is in the perception of law, in the perception of reality. I mean, I do not hesitate in saying that US bases in Hawaii, in Okinawa, in Diego Garcia, in the Indian Ocean, are instruments of neocolonialism. Not just of imperialism, but of neocolonialism, in order to maintain the hegemony of the United States in the world and its, shall we say, blackmailing of weaker countries through sanctions and through all sorts of coercive measures. The presence of 800 US bases throughout the world, encircling China, encircling Russia, etc., etc., that is a permanent threat. It's a permanent menace of the use of force. And I recall that Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the United Nations Charter, very clear on that. It prohibits not only the use of force, but it prohibits the threat of the use of force. And if you have a massive base like Okinawa next to China, that is a menace to China. If you have a massive base in Hawaii, that is a menace to the entire Pacific region. And of course, the intent is to send the message that the United States intends to use its military power if countries in the Pacific region do not play the US game. So there is a latent menace which is contrary to the letter and to the spirit of the UN Charter, particularly Articles 1 and 2. Now,
Professor, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Minister Xiao has to get going and catch his flight shortly, and I would just like to give him a chance to
of course,
provide some closing comments before he leaves. But we can come back to
sure. Go ahead.
You're muted, Minister Xiao.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, I'm sorry I have to catch a flight, but I wanted to just surmise or create a summary of what the situation of Hawaii is, and to say that we very much appreciate China's hand in creating or in submitting and having gotten past Resolution 48/7. Because it is significant, as Dr. Zayas pointed out. It actually provides orders on the part of the Human Rights Council saying that the United Nations needs to pay attention again, and not just to talk about, but to actually concretely act to decolonize. So what you take the decade for the declaration of the decade for the eradication of decolonization, eradication of colonialism, as well as the United Nations Human Rights Council's resolution. And both of those together really compel action. But the only way we can actually compel action is to hold feet to the fire. And so this is what we are planning on doing in Hawaii, and in partnership with others as well. And that is to bring forward specific actions that the United States could take to end the colonization or the occupation of our islands, because this is not, as I said, not a difficult thing. It just takes a political will to do so, because the actual action is to turn around and do the opposite of what has been doing. So we want to speak in terms of what can actually be done, because the discussion really is over. Colonialism is an evil thing, and we need to stop doing it. And all that it needs to do is to turn around and do the opposite of what was being done during the colonial period and up to today. So I just wanted to add that we are very, very positive and optimistic about the prospects of decolonizing, becoming once again an objective of the United Nations, and not just a verbal service to pronounce these wonderful goals without any action. So we are at this point pushing for concrete action. So thank you very much for including me in this conversation, and I really appreciate it. Aloha to all of you, and have a great conclusion to this discussion. Aloha.
Thank you, Minister Siu. Thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts. We hope you have a safe flight, and we'll talk to you again soon. Now, Professor Zayas, very sorry again for having to interrupt you.
And I'm very happy. I'm very happy to have heard Foreign Minister Leon Siu. I've known him now for many, many years, and I welcome his initiatives and his presentations in the Human Rights Council. Now, here, you mentioned this book, the Building a Just World Order, which was published September 2021, so a year ago, by Clarity Press. Since then, the second book in the trilogy, Countering Mainstream Narratives, Fake News, Fake Law, Fake Freedom, also came out with Clarity Press. And the third book in the trilogy will be coming out next year, probably in April, under the title The Human Rights Industry, in which I analyze shall we say, the deficits of the activity of United Nations human rights institutions and of the non-governmental organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, International Service on Human Rights, et cetera, and everything that they could do to make human rights a reality for everyone in the world. Now, I also very strongly endorse the fact that China is becoming more assertive in the Human Rights Council, in the General Assembly, in the Security Council. This is incredibly important for world peace. This is incredibly important for multilateralism. We have had much too long the problem of unilateralism, the problem of the unipolar world, which is intrinsically a form or an expression of neocolonialism, as an expression of imperialism. We have to move away from this kind of imperial mentality. Myself, I'm an American citizen, and I deplore the policies of my government. I very much endorse many initiatives of my government, but in this particular field, I find that world peace is being endangered by our intransigence and by our, shall we say, fighting a losing battle, because it's quite clear that the unipolar world has ceased to exist. We don't want to accept it, but it has ceased to exist. It's important. We must have the voice of China. We must have the voice of India. We must have the voice of Russia. All of these countries can contribute to a equitable and democratic world order. And that is what in my book, Building a Just World Order, which I draft in 25 principles. Among those 25 principles, I have the idea of a global compact on education, education for peace, education for empathy. These are things that can be done concretely in order to eradicate not only colonialism, but the mentality that goes with it, in order to eradicate the legacies of imperialism and of colonialism. I find it particularly interesting here that a few days ago, an article appeared in CGTN, picked up on Xinhua. So an article, an opinion piece by Stephen Ndegwa. Stephen Ndegwa is an African researcher, and he is in international relations at the University in Africa, executive director of the South Dialogues in Nairobi-based communication development think tank, et cetera, et cetera. I find it significant that this article by Dr. Ndegwa was published in CGTN, and where he decries that the crimes of the West, I'm quoting, the crimes of the West in other societies have been buried under the carpet over time. He goes on to say, what amends does the West intend to make in order to assuage the trauma that they left behind? Then he goes on to say that scholars refer to this phenomenon as neocolonialism, meaning the economic system that actually still controls the Africans and still controls so many countries in Asia and in Latin America, although they are nominally free, nominally sovereign. He goes on to say, while colonialism involved direct control over territory and its people, neocolonialism uses indirect methods to control a territory and its indigenous people, unquote. So I see this article being published in CGTN as a positive sign, a sign that the Chinese have acknowledged, have recognized that the time is ripe to bring these issues to discussion in the mainstream. I mean, it's a matter that has been indeed swept under the carpet for decades upon decades. But now I think it is crucial that we bring this up. Now, I thought that one of the concrete things that must be done, and I have spoken with my successor, Livingston Sewanyana, about it. I have given him a memo in which I participated as one of the co-authors concerning the necessity to revisit General Assembly Resolution 1469 of 1959. That is a resolution that allowed the United States to step out of Chapter 11 of the UN Charter, step out of the obligation under Article 73 of the UN Charter to report on the progress of the peoples of Alaska and Hawaii toward their independence, toward their self-government. As you know, a completely fraudulent referendum was held at the time in Alaska and Hawaii, and we know from many witnesses and many indigenous in both Alaska and Hawaii that the procedure of this so-called referendum was totally flawed. I mean, that indigenous were intimidated. Some of them were disqualified because they didn't speak English well enough. They were more or less persuaded not to participate, whereas not only did the settlers participate, but also even the members of the occupying forces of the U.S. Army were able to vote in these sham referenda. So the moment that the General Assembly starts looking just on the surface at these referenda, we'll realize that Resolution 1469 has to be revised. And the General Assembly has in the past revised its resolutions. I give one example alone, which is back in 1975, the General Assembly had adopted a resolution, Zionism is a form of racism. And in 1991, so 16 years later, when Israel made some peace overtures toward the Palestinians, and it seemed like the Palestinians were going to get their state and they were going to get self-determination, et cetera, then the General Assembly, as a gesture of goodwill, withdrew the resolution, Zionism is racism. So the same as the General Assembly withdrew that resolution, they certainly can withdraw 1469. That, of course, has consequences, has financial consequences and economic consequences, but it is necessary because a major injustice, not only a fraud on the United Nations and on the world has been committed, but a major injustice on the native populations of Alaska and of Hawaii. So that is a concrete thing that can be done. I also mentioned the role of UNESCO in bringing information on all of these cultures and all of these peoples who have been colonized and who have not had any kind of rehabilitation, whereas, say, the South Africans, notwithstanding the presence of many Europeans in South Africa today, but it is the majority African population that actually rules South Africa. The same thing goes for Zimbabwe. The same thing goes for Senegal and for Kenya and so on and so forth. That did not happen with the American indigenous peoples, because not only were they victims of genocide, they simply became a minority in their own continent, whereas they had inhabited the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Caribbean Sea to the Bering Sea. All that territory was indigenous territory, and it doesn't even make it into history books. You may find in a history book a mention of Sandy Creek massacre or of the Wounded Knee massacre, but the enormity of it is not in history books. So here, as I say, one of the major problems is education. lack thereof, information war, the fact that these inconvenient facts are suppressed by the media when these issues are being discussed. There's no reference to the prehistory, and that's why I find it important to quote Martin Luther King, because the integrity and the human rights commitment of Martin Luther King is beyond question. I mean, he has become an icon of American culture, you would say. On the other hand, no one cites the book Why We Can't Wait. No one cites the pages in which he deals with the genocide against the American First Nations. So this is a question of perception. There's no sense of responsibility, no sense of remorse, no sense of guilt for what was done to the indigenous, and what is continuing, because we are actually having a continuing genocide. We have a destruction of memory, what the Romans used to call damnatio memoriae. We destroy the memory of the indigenous, and the only thing that's left of them are the names of cities and towns and rivers. Mississippi, of course, means a big river, and Niagara is noisy water, and Manhattan is a stick floating in the water, and Potomac and Chicago and Idaho and Iowa and Utah, they're all indigenous names. So that remains, and the rest of the indigenous in America are in so-called reservations. There's been a crime against all of humanity in the Western destruction of the indigenous population of North America. And now moving back to the Pacific and to the Luchuans, I think that any number of Pacific islands would have an interest in requesting the General Assembly to list the Ryukyu Islands as non-self-governing territories, and then addressing the issue of the threat posed by the U.S. base in Okinawa, the threat to the region, the threat to China in particular. This allows me to bring the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of February 2019 in the Chagos Island case. That was a case of decolonization. When Great Britain supposedly decolonized the Mauritius Islands, just before decolonization, it actually took away the Chagos Islands archipelago from Mauritius, did not decolonize those islands, and then leased Diego Garcia to the United States so that the United States could put one of its massive bases in the Indian Ocean. There again, each one of these bases constitutes a menace, constitutes a threat to the peace for purposes of Article 39 of the UN Charter. And since not only the use of force, but the threat of the use of force is prohibited by the letter and spirit of the UN Charter, this should be addressed. The same as the International Court of Justice held that the Chagos Islands must be returned to Mauritius, and that the population of the Chagos Islands, the natives of the Chagos Islands, have a right to return to the Chagos Islands. The International Court of Justice could make a similar finding with regard to Japanese occupation, colonization of the Ryukyu Islands, and demand that this occupation cease, and also that the base in Okinawa be dismantled because it does not represent the will of the population of the Luchu people, and they have repeatedly spoken against the base, and especially against the expansion of the base. So here, linking up again with my discussion of the information war, these facts must be more generally known. It is important that they appear in the mainstream media. And that actually is perhaps the greatest obstacle. I explained that in several chapters of this book, the Countering Mainstream Narratives, because I don't see how to make progress on human rights or on the liberation of peoples and in providing rehabilitation to peoples if we are not dealing with contextualized history. If we don't have the facts, if we don't have the history, then unfortunately, there will not be any significant improvements, notwithstanding all of these resolutions, notwithstanding the discussions we had last week here in Geneva at the Human Rights Council on Resolution 48/7. I mean, it's not enough to put out a diagnosis that there is a problem. You have to have a plan of action. And in this plan of action, you have to incorporate the role of the International Court of Justice. You have to incorporate the role of UNESCO. And I could go on and on and on, but I want to hear again our friend Dr. Junyong. And so I give it back to you.
Thank you, Professor Zayas. Dr. Xiao, do you have anything you would like to add? Any closing thoughts or closing comments?
Okay, thank you. Could you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, I have sent my report by email for you, and I am very glad to take part in this online discussion, and I learned so much from the Zayas and Lian Su, and I also learned more from Robert. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Xiao. Yes, I have received the report you sent me, and I'll be sending that also to Professor Zayas, and we'll make
Please.
that available. Yes.
And your PowerPoint, you can send me your PowerPoint. Am I allowed to send it on to Livingston?
Yes, absolutely. Of course.
Because it is so well done that I might even, I suppose, if you send it to me, I can probably use it in my course here for my students. I think that they would find it fascinating. It was very clear. And I think it would actually awake in them the sense, why haven't I heard about this before? How is it possible that something like this could be so completely outside the mainstream media that we don't hear about these days? And that is one of the points that I try to teach my students, say, don't rely on the Wikipedia, don't rely on the search results you get in Google, because the algorithms simply filter out what the hegemons don't want you to know.
That's
so the fact is, there is a very, how we say, effective system of censorship, but the principal players in the censorship are actually the private sector, are actually the big tech, Google and Bing and Facebook and Twitter, etc., who are keen on maintaining, shall we say, the status quo, maintaining the power structures or the power equation as it stands today, because they do not want China or India or Russia to have any say in the running of the world economy. So I think it is important to make such things as your PowerPoint presentation available to students who are bright kids. Huh? I mean, when they see that, I can imagine for a young mind that they will be shocked. It's like when I wrote my first book, which was my dissertation. I had been a history student in high school and college, in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and I didn't finish my my history at Harvard. I finished it at the University of Göttingen in Germany. But interestingly enough, although I was an A student, in all of those years, I had never heard a word about the fact that at the end of the Second World War, 15 million ethnic Germans were expelled from their homelands in East Prussia, Pomerania, Silesia, East Brandenburg, Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, Serbia, Yugoslavia, etc. 15 million expellees, more than 2 million deaths. More than 2 million died in the course of that brutal expulsion. I mean, far worse than the ethnic cleansings of the 1990s in Yugoslavia. And there was nothing. No history book mentioned it, nothing. And when I learned about it, not in history class, I learned about it in a seminar on international law. And my then professor, Richard Baxter, said, you were looking for a topic for a dissertation. Why don't you take the expulsion of the Germans? And I must say my eyes popped. I said, wait a minute, you know, I'm an A history student. You mean to tell me that all of my professors for the last 16 years have failed to indicate that something this big happened, that they are complicit in sweeping it under the carpet. Why? What's going on? That was my reaction. So I wrote a book that sold over 100,000 copies called Nemesis at Potsdam. And then I did a television special in Germany in the 1980s on the book. And believe it or not, notwithstanding the success of the book, notwithstanding the success of the prime time television special that I did, you still don't find the expulsion of the Germans in history books. I teach not only international law, I teach history. The book that I'm using from Bachmann, I'm using it because I like many of his analysis of the French Revolution or of the Industrial Revolution, et cetera, but the expulsion of the Germans is not in there. 15 million people expelled, 2 million dead, 1/3 of Germany is taken off, given to Poland and Czechoslovakia, et cetera, not a word. Because the winners did these things, so they must be good. They're not supposed to criticize it. And the same thing, since colonialism, imperialism, is mostly associated with Europe and the United States. And because we are, by definition, the good guys, that simply doesn't make it into the history books. And there again, maybe China can press UNESCO to do a generalized study of history books in order to identify all the lacunae that there are in history books being used in the United States, Europe, and in the rest of the world, and see how, through a global compact on education, you can make sure that people are educated properly, thoroughly. Historical events are put into context, where you have chronology and context and comprehensiveness and causality and cui bono all taken into account, and where we don't just get a caricature of history, or a, shall we say, a story that, shall we say, cements the geopolitical interests of the Europeans and of the Americans. So opening the eyes of my students through your PowerPoint, through the presentation of Dr. Junyong, I think that is added value, that it's a positive measure that, at least in my very small circle, I will be able to project these ideas into the minds of my young students. I can only wish that more people, and I will, if you allow me, I will also share it with my friend Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University, and with Professor Richard Falk of Princeton, and Professor Stephen Kinzer of Boston, etc., because I think they themselves would benefit. I mean, I've learned a lot from you, from Leon, from Dr. Chu, and I think that we all, professors or not, we can learn from experiences as this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zayas, for your insight, your kind words, and of course your participation again on this webinar. Thank you also to Minister Leon Xiao of the Hawaiian Kingdom, and to Dr. Xiao Junyong for sharing your insights and expertise as well. We sincerely hope the United Nations and the international community at large will take these concerns seriously and take concrete action to address the urgent need for decolonization. Thank you to all of our viewers for watching, and we'll see you next time.